All right, thanks everyone for coming to the Utah Microservices meetup, May 25th, 2013. It's a Thursday. It's a lovely one. Tonight,
2013.
That's like 23, not 2013. Oh, we'll fix that one in post-prod too. Yeah, so I think, well, let's just go quickly around the room, say our names. Nadeem, we'll have you go last so that you can do the LVT spiel for hosting us in person. And then, so we can end on you, and then we will cut into the presentation. So let's just like really change this up, and let's go with the online folks first. I'll call your name out in the order you appear on my screen. So Aaron, want to introduce yourself?
I'm Aaron.
Nailed it.
You want more?
Whatever. Okay, we'll skip as ChatGPT will introduce you. Sean.
I'm Sean. I work with quite a number of people, both virtual. Casey, you're there, and Scott.
There too.
Scott, yeah.
Antoine.
So,
oh, sorry, I thought you were done, Sean.
no, that's it. Yep.
Same as Sean, but my name is Antoine.
Francesco, want to say hi?
I don't think he heard you.
Oh,
You did.
Francesco, we didn't hear you there.
There you go. Sorry, I put you on the computer. Hello, everybody. Oh, that's a lot of people.
Cool. Nathan, want to introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Nathan. I first met Scott a few years ago. I was walking down the street and somebody ran behind me with chloroform on a cloth and jumped on my back, piggyback style. And next thing I knew, I was a co-principal of Eventide. So.
And if you listen closely, you can hear Nathan below Scott's floorboards on his deck. So that's where his desk is.
Troy.
2 more pull requests till your freedom, Nathan.
So Troy Thomas. Work at LVT, been to all the meetings, so that's it.
Ron
Kimball, process engineer at LiveView Technologies.
I'm Ethan. I work at Omni, do Eventide stuff there.
I'm Jerry, and I work at LVT.
Eric Peterson, work at LVT, regular visitor here.
Justin James, I also work at LVT.
Scott Abbott, I work at Wilson Sonsini.
Casey Allred, Wilson Sonsini. Connor Whitfeld, LiveView.
Swapna, LiveView Technologies.
Awesome.
And Nadeem is coming.
Is almost here.
He's gonna introduce us to the pizza.
Yeah. All right, I need to stall for like 45 seconds or something, but as always, we are very grateful to LiveView Technologies for hosting us in person and providing food. And they're hiring. There's a careers page. You can go to it and look at it.
LVT.com. Don't go to liveview.com.
Yeah, don't go to liveview.com. LVT.com.
On a Scott Abbott shirt, and this is what not to do.
Yeah. Okay.
But we're rebranding.
All right. Oh, hey, Nadeem's here. Anything you want to say about LVT besides we're hiring? Go check out LVT.com.
And introduce yourself.
Oh, and introduce yourself.
Nadeem is here. Love to host our monthly meetups here, and we enjoy having you everybody here every month. And food here if you guys want to grab it. And thank you.
Awesome. Okay. I don't want us to miss Scott's presentation because we're getting pizza. So I could start slowly reading his bio. Here, give us live a 2-minute pause we can go get food, bring it back. And then
That's a good idea.
we'll get into the main event here. So sorry, remote folks, I'll be back.
2 minutes.
Real quick.
This is going to be an incredibly compelling video presentation for.
I restarted it.
Oh, you did.
Wait, someone else is playing that now. Okay, let's do it.
You looked busy.
I'm gonna go see if I can get Aaron's, beans and stuff, right?
I was like, you should get pizza. And then I went, you can't.
Yeah.
Are we still recording?
I don't know. Not recording.
Not recording?
It is recording.
Oh.
It's okay. We can edit it out later.
There's a record on the screen.
Can I ask you? I have to record you and then send it to my daughter and then she will translate it for me.
You don't know sign language? Come on. No, I don't. Everybody should learn sign language.
Yeah, everybody should learn sign language. I think that's the easiest one to learn. Better than other languages, right? Probably.
It's just a completely different paradigm of language, right? So it depends on if you're good at that paradigm or not, right?
More universal, isn't it?
No,
You sort of talk to people.
I mean, no. Like, there's a lot of variants of sign language, right? There's American Sign Language, British Sign Language, like all the different flavors. There's Sign Exact English. There's a chat sorts of stuff. You need to be right back.
Hey, we're all eating too.
British Sign Language has a U in color.
What?
I said British Sign Language has a U in the word color. In the sign for color.
Color. Yeah. What kind of beverages do they have? Maybe
Oh, I just grabbed one from the fridge.
oh, hey, even better.
There's some additional drinks if you in the kitchen.
I was gonna drink water, but if there's something in flavor, I'll just feel something with flavor.
I would like to thank LiveView for sending me this beer. I know that nobody else got beer, but hey, man, thank you.
Is that the only way you can put up with us, Scott?
No, I'm actually feeling a little celebratory. I think the code we just finished is good. I think the presentation is nice.
Pop it on my phone.
Feeling pretty good. Feeling pretty good. That means Aaron is about to burst my bubble.
It means you've got nowhere to go but down. That's what it means.
Yeah. And here it comes. Yeah, this might be the first presentation I'm looking forward to giving because it's just nice and compact and makes sense. Yeah, I look forward to getting a big fat nothing in terms of feedback on this, just like all presentations. I think the guys from Wilson are going to be potentially impacted by these changes, impacted positively. Of course, I don't know the LiveView code base or the Omni code base, so I'm looking forward to hearing at the end of it. Well, I know we'll probably talk about it. I know Aaron's going to probably talk at me about it tomorrow. Yeah, we'll see. Actually, I think you guys have all seen it already. They've seen prototypes. Are we
Can we
ready to
delete
go?
substitute record afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
No. All it takes is a very large code migration then.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm talking about
He's looking for something.
It's nothing that an Emacs macro can't handle, I suppose.
Sure.
Emac what?
Sorry, what is it?
The Vim
I-
key.
The macro.
Don't you hate coding with your hands?
Do you know what he was looking for?
He's just digging through all the closets or the drawers.
We're still waiting on Nadim.
Oh yeah, Nadim and Braun.
I can go and fetch them.
They should know where the door is.
Yeah, would you? We can go.
Yeah, probably.
Okay, all right. Let's start this. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Scott Bellware. What? Oh, I turned it back on. When everyone said we should post this on YouTube with the 5-minute break in there, because that'd be banging content, like I hit the recording back. So, Scott Bellware is a co-founder of the Eventide project and MessageDB, the author of the Doctrine of Useful Objects and the techniques used to provide diagnostic substitutes with Eventide's tools. He works with software teams on evented and message-based systems, as well as architecture remediation. If everyone did that, that would be awesome. He's been on a 10-year mission to incorporate all the good things he's learned in the distributed systems world with all the good things he's learned in the mainstream web app world. He's a software professional with 25 years of industry experience and has been hands-on in virtually every role in a software organization, from developer to QA to product manager to CTO. Scott spends most of his waking hours in front of a computer, but is equally happy up to his elbows in dirt, making delicious things grow in his garden. Scott Bellware, thank you for presenting tonight. The time is yours, good sir.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. The subject tonight is substitutes, diagnostic substitutes, and simpler ones. And this came up after the presentation that Ethan did last month on telemetry and substitutes, which is a way that we do things inside the Eventide toolkit for some really key and core objects in the system, like the Eventide writer, for example. If you look in the writer source code, you'll see a diagnostic substitute, and it's fairly detailed, and it's fairly heavy-handed. The implementation is good. It's correct from a design perspective, from a design patterns perspective, but it's pretty heavyweight, and we tend to not. So the project that we work on tends to have a lot of HTTP interaction with third-party services, and building a diagnostic substitute that has telemetry of the sort and the rigor of the writer substitute is ultimately too heavy-handed. So we've got a couple generations and iterations of different ways to do these things, and some of that experience has fed into new ideas about how we could just use a library inside Eventide called Mimic that would be useful for creating really simpler diagnostic substitutes. So, and if all this terminology doesn't really make sense yet, we'll go over all of it as we go through the talk. So first things first, just get some things out of the way. The Eventide project is doing its first conference. It's going to be a rather lightweight mini conference, I guess you could call it. Half of it is retreat, and the other half is conference. There's 3 days of conference, which is going to be mostly focused on the progress we're going to be making towards version 3, or we call generation 3 of the toolkit. Meaning we'll go over the features that we're gonna, the capabilities that we'll have, the changes that will be made. And we're also going to spend some time doing some of the work, getting some of the work started. And as well as anybody who's there who wants to be, made familiar or trained, I guess you could say, taught how to become a committer. We're going to make some time available to help anybody who's got a laptop and wants to be a committer to get familiar with the tooling. And we'll probably work in pairs on that and choose a pull request or choose an issue and close an issue. So 3 things I would say is big thing is community, version 3, new commit orientation, and actual work sessions on generation 3, plus we're gonna try to use some of this time, not just as hardcore focus work time, but also some time to breathe and regenerate. Courtney on Vancouver Island is a quirky little place. It's very green. It's one of those seaside towns with great fresh air, cool fresh air. Wonderful mountain views, wonderful sea views. A small town, very manageable to walk around in. And we would hope that anybody who's interested in getting a little bit deeper into Eventide and might actually even be interested in learning how to make some contributions on the next version. We'd love to see you there, and you can contact us on the Eventide Slack to get any additional information you'd like. But we'll probably start circulating some more information soon enough, and we'll put up a website as well with a little bit more information. Right. Let's get into, aside from Mimic, let's dig into some of the fundamentals of what we're talking about here with dependencies and with substitutes. The topics we're going to cover: dependencies, obviously. That's the whole point of the Mimic library and the dependency library that depends on the Mimic library. How we avoid using mock objects by leveraging the null object pattern and extending that pattern into substitutes, and by leveraging substitution and implementing substitutes and extending that further with Mimic implementations and diagnostics and telemetry. So dependencies. Dependency is a simple concept. Straight up, this is what it looks like in code when we're using Eventide's dependency macro. This is well, I'll get into more detail what it. So a bit about dependencies. They're references to other objects where those objects typically represent things like system resources and I/O. So any sort of file system access, any sort of network access, HTTP, or even the system clock. They should be declared explicitly in object interfaces or in object definitions to differentiate them from other kinds of attributes that can be on an object. And additionally, a dependency attribute's value should never be nil. So that means a no method error would never be the result of invoking a method on a dependency. And a dependency attribute is always assigned a value or default value that is an inert object, so that it will not raise a no method error. The attribute on the bottom is a data attribute. This data attribute can be nil. So if you had a data structure, like, well, forget that this has a dependency on it, but if you had, let's say, a data structure, an active record object, something that represents data attributes in a data structure can be nil. A dependency attribute, which is also an attribute in Ruby, should never be nil or can never be nil. It's presumed that it'll never be nil. Should never have an instance. You should never be able to create an instance of a class and have things that are I/O objects or external integration objects and have those be nil. So you can see here, we're calling some dependency do something, which is really, well, we'll get into it, but it's any old method. So as soon as I instantiate this some class object, we can start invoking methods on the dependency attribute. But the data attribute, the straight plain old adder accessor, unless that is given a value somehow, we should expect that no method errors or undefined method errors are going to be called on nil class, because that's the default value of an adder accessor. The issue here is that data attributes are supposed to vary from instance to instance. So an instance of a data class or a data structure class, in one instance, you might have first name attribute, and that might be John. In the second instance, first name attribute might be Sue. But dependency attributes don't vary from instance to instance. So if instance one had a dependency called uploader, it's always going to be the uploader. It's not going to be some other like completely different thing. It's not going to be a John or a Sue. It's going to be an uploader in every single case for every class. Even though, well, and technically you could say that they may be subclasses of the uploader, but they're all within the uploader object family. And the underlying principle here is that IO objects or dependency objects should always be ready to be used when their efferent object or the containing object is instantiated. And that's what it means. That's what this useful objects things mean. It means that the object is useful. It's useful because it's ready to be used. And we don't require of the users of the objects we develop to learn all of the internals and ins and outs of how to construct objects dependencies in order to build and use an object that we've put into our code base for other people to use. And the really sort of deep software design and OO design precept in play here is that dependencies don't actually have to do, they're not required to do the operational job that they're supposed to do. Like the uploader dependency doesn't actually have to upload. The only rule, or the rule, not the only rule, but the rule that must be conformed to, and no other rules matter, is that dependency objects simply have to conform to an interface. What is that interface? It's whatever the dependencies interface is. So if it's uploader.upload, then all instances or all implementations of an uploader must have the upload method on it. And that's it. That's the only rule in OO, and that's the fundamental one that we have to come to terms with. And this leads us to substitution. And the ultimate, I guess the ultimate, the canonical definition of substitution, what it means in languages like Ruby or any language that is based on polymorphism, is some interesting math that you can read on Wikipedia, and some interesting axiomatic set theory language, if you'd like. That article is really good, even though it's quite technical and deals with type theory. But point here is that any object that implements an interface, and I'm using this uploader as an example, any object that implements the interface is to be considered as valid or as legitimate as any other object that implements the interface. So as long as two objects or two implementations conform to the same interface, from an OO perspective, and actually other language paradigms as well, they are the same. And no substitute can be or should be ever considered of greater value to the solution than any other substitute. And that's true even when one substitute may do absolutely nothing at all. The only rule, or I keep saying the only rule, it's not the only rule, it's the golden rule, the one thing that you need to focus on as an OO developer is this notion of substitutability. In fact, it is the definition of polymorphism. And the misconception, which is held in the minds of probably 99% of all software developers using OO languages, is that a subclass relationship or inheritance relationship can be described as using the words is a. It's an is a relationship. That's absolutely wrong. It's absolutely false. It's absolutely misinformation. And it's been harming the OO software development community in the mainstream world since OO went mainstream. The correct way, the de facto way, the only way to see polymorphic relationships or subclass relationships is not to say that it's an is a relationship, but it's is substitutable for. Everything else doesn't matter. Everything else is misinformation, and it's just popular myth. And there's a lot of that in the software development world. So we shouldn't be surprised to learn that the thing that we've always thought is true, is in fact just more conspiracy theory. Well, we get this pushback, and part of your mind might do this. if you have an implementation of an object, you get two implementations of an uploader. One does the uploading and one just does absolutely nothing. It's just a no op. And you would say, you know, that object doesn't do anything. How can we possibly consider that to be an equal value? And the problem with that statement, it's an anthropomorphic statement. It's from the perspective of the developer. The developer wants to do some things. The developer wants to get the software to upload. That's utterly irrelevant and completely a distraction to the world of OO. What we need to be careful of are the laws of physics of OO, not the laws of physics of programmers and programmers' concerns. So we only care about contract conformance. That means we only care that if a dependency is supposed to have an uploader on it, that the thing that is put in that uploader's slot in that attribute does in fact have the uploader interface. All other concerns are irrelevant, even to the point of saying that it doesn't even matter whether the uploader actually does uploading. So come to peace with this, because most of the difficulties we have in software, not most of them, a good deal of difficulties we have in software is simply due to software developers not understanding the fundamental laws of physics that apply to OO or that OO was created from.
Scott, can I ask a question? Is that all right?
Absolutely.
So a substitute, as a programmer, a software developer or an engineer, whichever I could be classified as, it does do something. If it doesn't upload or download, which would consume my bandwidth and be inappropriate for a development or testing environment, it holds a place for me. It allows my software to operate without doing the expensive thing. So isn't that considered doing something? It seems a little wrong to say that it doesn't do anything.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But you've already crossed that chasm. You've already come to terms with this facet of the laws of software development. You know, you're in a good position. I would say you're in a minority. Everybody in the room might be in a minority, for that matter. I might be preaching to the choir. But the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of the world out there in software development land doesn't believe that, because they're focused on the things that they're being evaluated, that the humans are being evaluated on, getting a job done, getting an upload done. You hear this all the time when people say, like, don't use mock objects because you're not testing the real system. That's about the worst expression of misunderstanding of software design that I can imagine. Now, we don't use mock objects, but we have other reasons for that that we'll get into. But if you take the word mock object, a mock object is just sort of a word that we use amongst the population of people who don't understand the language of software development or the language of software design particularly. Once you get to the next level or go deeper into software design and have a deeper command of it, you'll see mock objects as simply just another substitute, but also a really clunky one. So yeah, in your case, the thing that you said is absolutely right. It's doing something. It's holding place, and it's the best thing it's doing is not being undefined or a nil.
Okay, thank you.
Which is great. That brings us to the null object pattern. So the piece of code I showed you before, this dependency, ultimately when this object is instantiated, that some dependency attribute is a null object. That means that you can call methods on it, and you won't get a no method error on nil response. It also means you can call just about any method on that dependency. And, this is probably, not a good idea. And that's the nature of the null object pattern. The null object pattern is there so that a dependency object is not nil. But in that, a null object allows any invocation against it. You could see what the people who don't understand mock objects, don't understand that area of software design, what they're rebelling against when they say mock objects are about not testing the real system, and you can call any old method on a mock object and it'll work. Like, this is the kind of thing, and this is the essence of the null object pattern. But we don't have to limit ourselves to the null object pattern. So let's talk about a mimic. A mimic is you could consider it a strongly typed or a strict null object. Here you see that dependency. Well, we've got a different implementation now. We're going from just something called some class. We're going to actually start talking about something. I mean, it's still an example. It's going to like have methods that are not implemented. It's still a fake example, but we've got an upload class, and the upload class has a dependency on an HTTP client. So here we're declaring the dependency on the HTTP client, but we're saying that its interface is the HTTP client class. So its type, its data type, you could say, of this dependency attribute is HTTP client. So when we instantiate the upload class and call HTTP client post, there's no failure. However, if you call any old method you want on that HTTP client class, there will be an undefined method error. Unlike the null object pattern, it won't accept any old method invocation that you can throw its way. So a mimic is it's not strongly typed, it's statically typed, or it's statically defined. So working with mimics, here is the mimic library in Eventide. It allows us it receives a class or a constant. Well, it's a constant. Every class in Ruby is a constant. So the mimic actuator, the call method, receives a class and it returns an instance of an object, which is the HTTP client object, but it's not this HTTP client object you're seeing up at the top of the code sample. It's another object that implements the same interface as HTTP client, which means it has the post method, but it's an utterly inert implementation of the HTTP client. It's not actually doing network work. It's not requiring HTTP stuff to be available and operational, but you can invoke its methods. The mimic library, our mimic library has telemetry, which means when you instantiate or when you construct a mimic, you can pass an argument called record, set it to true. And when you do that, any invocation against the HTTP client will be recorded in the client's own telemetry. So every mimic object has a record of the methods that have been invoked against it, and you can check whether something was invoked by using the mimic's predicate API, which allows you to query the mimic for a method name. So this colon post is a symbol of the method name that just says, did we call post, and did we send in the value some content for the argument named content. And this is how we turn invocation recording on. This record colon true. There's also a stricter interface on the telemetry recording predicate, or I got all that jumbled up. There's a strict predicate, which allows us to ask if something was invoked once, which is really quite useful. Most of the time when we write diagnostic substitutes, we really, because of the way we design objects to be single use and single purpose, we really care that their dependencies are invoked once. Most of the time, not always. Don't take that as a law, but it's frequently the case. And the telemetry API of Mimic allows you to query an invocation, which will return an invocation object. That's actually from a library in Eventide called invocation. You can, it's not really terribly useful for anything other than diagnostics, but you construct an invocation from a binding, almost like the way you call binding.irb. Actually, it's kind of useful in binding.irb. If you're in binding.irb and say like create an invocation from this binding, it'll give you back the method name and all the parameter names and parameter values that went back with it. But mimic.invocation will allow you to query for an invocation based on the method names and the parameters and see if it's there. One invocation is the stricter form of that. What happens here if there's two method invocations in the telemetry records that match the method name and parameters, an exception will be raised. And also, by the way, both of these methods or all of these methods can be invoked without passing the parameters and without passing the method name. Actually, I'm sorry, invocation and one invocation can't, but invocations can. Invocations will return the list of telemetry records for the method invocations. There should be another one here. This is an unfortunate mistake.
This is being recorded, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Why, you want to see the mistake? You want to like rub my nose in it later? Is that what's
Nathan, I can send you the list of all the mistakes that he's made.
Excellent.
Is there more? There's not more, is there?
Oh, not
it-
so far in this presentation, no.
Like all the mistakes of my life, of my career. Yeah, I've known Aaron since like 2007, so I'm happy to know that he's been keeping a log.
Well, he
of
actually
my mistakes.
he buries mistakes like a squirrel buries nuts. Bring him up when the moment calls for it.
Moving right along. So you can see more about the Mimic telemetry API and the rest of the API and in the README and the Mimic GitHub repo in the Eventide organization. Okay, specialized Mimic. A little bit different. Here we pass a block to the Mimic constructor. And in that block, we can add other methods that we would like. So here we're adding a method called posted. The value of this, and it's really, really important for creating diagnostic substitutes that aren't a spew of mechanical twaddle all over your code, is giving the substitute a method, an inquiry method that makes sense for the domain that you're working on. So if you can post using the HTTP client, you should be able to ask the Mimic whether it posted instead of whether it invoked. Invoked is a very low level mechanical. It needs to be there. But when you're creating diagnostic substitutes, you should be creating a domain specific API so that your users aren't forced to use the very low level internals of Mimic's own predicate API, which is the invoked and the invoked ones and the invocations, those kinds of things. So we can use these things together. We can put Mimic and dependency together. But first, let's talk about let's talk about the dependency macro and a specialized use of the dependency macro, which is super critical to building diagnostic substitutes. And it's the way it's done in Eventide's own classes, like the writer class and other classes that have diagnostic substitutes. And through all of our projects code too, we use this same mechanism. How it works is the HTTP client class, which is the dependency of the upload class. Upload has dependency on HTTP client. If you implement an inner module named substitute inside a class that's going to be used as a dependency, and if you implement a constructor on that module called self.build, you can return anything you want And that will become the default value of the dependency. So here I've done something completely absurd. This is not what you would want to do. And the reason is that object.new is absolutely not substitutable for HTTP client. It's an object. It doesn't have the upload method, but just goes to show that once you implement a specialized substitute constructor, it's all up to you to make things right and to make sure you're doing the right thing. But you can construct another implementation here or define another implementation of an HTTP client class that can, that can respond, you can have it respond with content. You can do all the HTTP client stuff that needs to be done to make your application or any of your code that interacts with this client not fail, and also give you the ability to verify how that client was interacted with. We can use the same technique here, and here's where we here's how we get mimic. And this is relative to, I'm saying this in relation to what Ethan was talking about last month, where he implemented a diagnostic substitute using the telemetry library, which is correct. It's the right thing to do, but you want to do that when you really need that kind of precise and rigorous machinery. So the point of this talk was the comment I made to Ethan that says when I said you could build substitutes using the mimic library, just using the straight old-fashioned mimic library and implementing custom predicate methods, query methods that allow you a domain-specific API to check whether or not the thing that is your object that you created, whether and used as a dependency, whether or not it's been interacted with in a way that's consistent. Now, this was not possible last month, actually. Mimic did not allow, see this invoked once method being called. I should have put line numbers on here, my apologies. And I don't know how to do annotations, or you have a laser pointer in Zoom. I'm sure Aaron knows the way to do it. And you're gonna just let me.
We see your cursor. Your cursor is visible.
Oh, you can see my cursor. Oh, that's so nice. I would have chosen a nicer cursor. I don't know. So yeah, this invoked once method, this did not exist last month. So when I made this proposal to Ethan, I then started thinking through the sample code and then looked inside the Mimic library and realized that I really never built a nice API for Mimic to allow this. So we had to scramble a little bit to make this work, but now it works, and it's quite nice. And this is actually based on a library that Nathan wrote for our work project. That has a very similar interface that accepts a method name. It accepts the arguments. And I won't talk about what the interface was before, but it was really convoluted. So nice and tight. Inside the substitute, you can create a mimic, turn the recorder on, create your own domain-specific predicate methods, and use the underlying mimic predicate API to query the state of the telemetry. So here you're seeing a much more realistic implementation of the upload class. It has a dependency, and we're going to pass a file into it, and it's going to use the HTTP client to post a file. So when we instantiate the upload class, it's still a mimic. It's still an inert dependency. We'll get to how to make that a real operational dependency later. So we can instantiate it, actuate the uploader, and then ask the upload class, ask its HTTP client dependency whether or not this content here was posted. And that's using the Mimic library to create simpler forms of diagnostic substitutes without having to undertake the rigor of a more heavyweight diagnostic like Eventide's writer and other objects. But again, that doesn't mean you can use this for everything. sometimes you might want that rigor of using the telemetry library and the stuff that Ethan showed last month. So dependency creates mimic objects under the hood. That means just this code on the screen, just this dependency HTTP client with the HTTP client interface, that uses the mimic library to construct that dependency's default value. So again, when we instantiate the upload class and actuate it, you can have access directly using the dependency macro as opposed to, well, forget about it. We'll move forward instead of backwards. You will have access to the predicate API of the mimic itself, which again is the low-level mechanical invoked predicate, where you pass it a method name and argument value, as opposed to this nice domain-specific predicate API that we've created using a specialized substitute. So let's, oh yeah, one point to make. When we're using mimic, we have to turn the recorder on. Mimic doesn't record by default. When we're using the dependency macro, the recorder is turned on by default. You can turn it off by, there's another argument I didn't put here. It's just record : false, and that'll turn recording off. But most of the time, it's sensible to presume that the dependency is going to record telemetry. But again, it uses this low-level invoked API, which isn't really the nicest thing to do to the users of this class. If you're implementing this stuff and you offer this to the rest of the people on your team, this isn't really a good thing to do to other people. So we can specialize the mimic dependency. And how that's done is very similar to how we specialize any dependency. We implement a substitute module, but instead of putting a constructor on this substitute module, we're just going to put methods in it. So how this works, if the substitute module, and I'm going to flip back here to show you what I mean. This was the first example I showed you where the inner substitute module has a constructor, a self.build method. And that means you're taking the reins, and you are, you're providing the implementation. With a specialized mimic, sorry, I'm being spammed on Slack, and I don't need to know. I need to know if this is messages coming from people in this in this session. And in fact, if you would give me 1 second, my apologies. I need to kill Slack. If anybody is like in the audience slacking me, thank you. I'll get to your message as soon as I can. Right. So if the substitute inner module does not have a build method on it, the self-build constructor, it's just going to treat the substitute module like a mix-in. What happens is when the dependency is initialized and it's given the mimic of the HTTP client, it finds this substitute module and then mixes it in to this object, which means that the posted predicate method can now be invoked on the substitute. It's a little bit convoluted, but suffice to say, if any class has an inner module named substitute, it will be used by the dependency macro. If there's no constructor on that module, it will be treated like a plain old mixin. And here in this method that's mixed in, we're actually accessing the mimic's telemetry predicate API. I don't know the difference between these things except for their magnification. One moment, please. I just want to kill this slide before I go on. It's got a duplicate in here.
It's got mimic recorder predicate in there.
What's that?
There are differences.
There are different.
Oh,
There's a
damn it.
mimic recorder precedent.
And I lost my slide. There we go. There we go. Okay, right. Thank you. Thank you for spotting that. Right. There's this other thing, this other version of doing this. That's using this module, mimic recorder predicate, that provides a predicate macro, which generates the predicate based on the method name that it's calling. But the usage of this is actually also a little bit mechanical. And I think it's not as good. It's there. I think it's experimental. And I wouldn't be surprised if the way this is used in practice is by implementing domain specific methods like this. Because see here, when we query the substitute, we just have to pass in the content. We don't have to say what the parameter name is. So I've got a feeling that this module might not be used, and I wouldn't be surprised if in the next very short term, based on feedback, and I'd love your feedback, you guys' feedback on this, whether you think you would use it or not. I wouldn't be surprised if it's removed from the implementation entirely, because I think this is just nicer, it's simpler, and it doesn't require this generated thing, and this is just easier to understand, I think.
Yeah, like the line difference is 1 probably. Yeah, actually, yeah, 1 line.
Yeah. There's no savings here. It's just obscure. I mean, I'll probably do a poll at the end of the presentation and see where we go with this. Okay. All the while, this dependency is still a mimic. It's still a substitute value. It's not an operational dependency. It doesn't do uploading. So let's talk about how we construct operational dependencies. You've probably seen this a few times in presentations in this meetup group. We do that by implementing a constructor, a secondary constructor or factory method, we call it a constructor, that isn't the new method, because we want to preserve the new method for just creating a minimally initialized instance of the object. So here we're calling upload.new, and we use the new method rather than the build method. It's an initialized object, but the dependencies are set there to their defaults, which is a diagnostic substitute or some form of substitute, whether it's a null object, a mimic object, or a specialized mimic object. And you can see that here when we look at what, after calling new, we look at what the HTTP client is. In this case, it's an implementation of a mimic class. It's a dynamically generated class. If we call the constructor calls new, but then assigns the HTTP client to a real operational HTTP client, and then returns that instance. So in your real code, your real applicative code, in your operational code, you will use the build method to construct objects that you plan to use, live objects that you plan to use. However, in diagnostic code, you will use just the initializer. And what I mean by diagnostic code, or what I should say is diagnostic code is a class of things that also includes tests. So say it's simpler, your test code will use the initializer. Any diagnostic code will use the initializer. All operational code will use the constructor, which is this factory method. So things to consider. Diagnostic substitutes are not mock objects. We think of probes rather than spies. Spies is a word that comes from the mock test spies, test doubles, mock objects, test stubs. That's all from the language of mock objects. Mock objects are about test code. Probes and substitutes, that's about the design of dependencies. And we think about telemetry, not about expectations. Expect that such and such will be called with such and such arguments. That's the lens of mock objects. And mock objects are something that are forced upon a design from a test script. They're imposed upon a design, shoved in from the outside, instantiated and configured in a test script. Substitutes are an inherent part of the design itself. They're part of proper dependency segregation. And proper dependency segregation is part of what we would say is the elegance of design. And elegance has a meaning, has a mathematical meaning in software design or in structural design. Elegance, or something that is elegant, is said to be simple and appropriate for the audience. And you can look up elegance, the mathematical meaning of elegance, on Wikipedia as well. So mock objects are brute force. Substitutes are elegance. And I always say this, mock objects are like picking your nose with a jackhammer. You know, you'll get the job done, but your face will be a bloody mess after it. But your nose most certainly will be picked. If you want to get access to this deck, open up your iPhones, take a snapshot of this, or just use your iPhone camera to resolve the barcode, or you can get it from that bit.ly link. And once you have this slide deck, you can also get access to the sample code that I built this presentation out of. So instead of trying to see it in screen captures of code, there's a step-by-step demos of this stuff if you want to take a look at it. And that's the end. Thanks.
That was fantastic, Scott. Thank you.
I have a
Thank
question, if that's okay.
Oh, it's really, really dark. Hold on a second. Echo, patio maximum. Now you know how to totally run my electricity bill if you happen to be on my street one day.
You've really been missing that opportunity. Echo, let there be light.
Oh man.
See,
Can we edit that in and post, Ethan? That's brilliant.
I look at it like Scott commanded Echo to turn his patio lanterns on.
No, there's no Canadians on the call who know that reference. It's an inside joke. Look up the song Patio Lanterns. It's a very famous Canadian pop song. For all those people who are going to come to Courtney in September, you're gonna want to know your Canadian pop music. There's gonna be
just so everyone knows how little Canada matters, Patio Lanterns is one of the most important moments in Canadian rock history, and none of us have ever heard of it.
Thank you, Nathan. I feel so much better. Are there any other Canadians in the room? Francesco's Canadian, but you're not really in the Canadian pop from the 80s, are you? So yeah, of course, questions are fine. Now's the time.
Okay, so I'm going to try to speak through this, but I don't always choose the right words. So forgive me, but if I have got two...
I'm waiting for you to say, what an idiotic pile of garbage.
No. I've got two pathways that I want to test in my code, and I want to set up using controls in my test and use the mimic this to get a substitute once that is configured to make an appropriate HTTP response that I would normally expect, and another that would be, say, a 500. How would I go about doing that?
You would probably be in the territory of not using a dynamic mimic object for that. You would probably be constructing your own bespoke from scratch substitute class. You may find that the mimic is useful for certain things, like to record if something was called. But you know, if you allow mimic to have the ability to check whether HTTP client .post was called, then mimic is going to replace the post method entirely with its own stuff. And what you want is a post method that returns whatever response body that, you know, you're interested in. So this is really a thing that happens with implementing substitutes of objects that are queries, that return stuff. You know, the easiest mimic, the easiest substitutes to create, the best ones to create are ones that don't return anything. They're fire and forget. They're tell, don't ask. But if you need to return something from a query, whether it's an HTTP object or a database object or a third-party service or whatever it is, you're going to need to implement a method called something like set response on that substitute, and you need your post method to return whatever the response is.
Okay, and we are actually doing that, and so I wanted to know that you felt that was appropriate.
There's no way. I don't know if it's appropriate, but there's no choice.
Scott, we should talk after at some point about maybe using module prepend for the invocation recording and an optional super requirement.
And super?
Yeah, and you could do it if defined super and only call it if it's actually defined.
Can I put that in Mimic itself?
Yeah.
Oh, that's yeah, let's definitely talk about that.
I don't.
So you can set your response. I don't know what would be.
You could define a method, a specialized method, and still have it recorded, and not have to call super yourself.
But let's remember this library is called mimic. Like it's the behavior of a mimic object is that it mimics another object behavior. It doesn't wrap an object's behavior, right?
It might go in dependency, or it might go in substitute. I mean, there might be a place in the stack to do this. I don't know, like that's not where my mind is right now, but so Nathan's objection is absolutely spot on about mimic. Let's see where else in this in the 3-tiered stack that it can show up, and if we can pull it off, because that solution would be I know I see it now. That would be pretty great.
We'd use it all the time. My team integrates with integrates our product with other business processes and third-party providers that help our business run. And so they sometimes give us bad responses, and we'd like to be able to test that our components are correctly handling when they're offline or when they're not authorized.
Yeah, and that should be part of the mimics or the substitutes API. Like you should have a method that's like set bad response or set response with blah blah blah. Like you can consider that. The challenge there is, by the way, every time you add a new method to the substitute, it's straying further and further away from the interface that it's substituting. So you just got to watch out for adding. So it's okay for a subclass substitute to be additive because they still have a shared interface, but you do have to watch out for creating like it's the kind of thing where you can create a conflict, like overriding a method that that is actually on the operational implementation.
Okay, thank you.
All the predicate API as well is has that same downside. We put an invoked method on an invoked once method and an invocations method. That's all going on your substitute class. But those are all aliases. Every one of those methods is actually defined as underscore underscore invoked and underscore underscore invoked once, and they're alias. So if you actually have for some reason, if you have some class that has a method on it that needs to be on it named invoked, an invoked predicate, I don't know why you would have that, but just in case, you're still safe. You still have access to the unaliased version of it. So you might consider those
underscore invoked.
What's that?
Maybe you should go with 3 underscores just to be safe.
If you start using unders in normal code, I'm concerned.
Yeah, you never know. Like I can't know that. Like that's just it. To be a good citizen of the software community, we have to provide those accommodations.
Thank you.
Very like the new API, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah, right on.
I was looking for a way to replace the famous instance spy from RSpec because of many reasons.
Yeah.
And yeah, Mimic now it's a straight upgrade.
Sweet.
I was thinking about the substitute predicate macro, or rather the mixin, and why that might be desirable. In your example with post, if you had a posted predicate, and let's say you wanted to check to see like what were the headers, I set headers, and sometimes you do care about the headers and sometimes you don't. With the posted predicate like that, you could, in this case, would you just, if you wanted to know that the content and the headers were set, you would pass in content and headers. If you only cared about the content, you really didn't care about whatever headers got pushed in, like you would only specify the content. If you end up defining that, what in the other example where you defined your own applicative method posted, yeah, like how could you do the posted predicate and be like, I want content and headers, but
dot
is that what you do? Just dot and forward
I
it?
mean, you could even combine them, right? Like, or you could do like star quargs,
Yeah.
KWArgs, like any one of those delegation patterns will work.
As a positional, just okay.
You can keep one positional and do the rest with dot or KWArgs.
Okay.
You could do two positional, one of them being optional. I mean, you can compose it any way you want, but you always have that fallback to do the star KWArgs at the end.
Yeah.
The dot thing that they're talking about, if you guys aren't familiar with it, is Ruby's parameter matching syntax. So if you're not familiar with declaring methods without actually giving parameter names or using the destructurer, the asterisk, check out the dot syntax in a method definition. Yeah,
so
I think the answer to your question, Sean, is
dot
programming. It's it's programming. It can be done. It's a matter of implementation details. Should be a matter of implementation details.
So I'll just statement. I'm curious to hear everyone else. So I'll just speak from my experience. I've probably got at least 200 hours logged implementing substitutes that probably could have taken me minutes instead of hours over the years. I'm curious if anybody else, like who else has implemented substitutes by hand from scratch and felt like this new interface could have greatly reduced not only reduce the implementation cost, because that's just one metric and it's not even the most important one, but also introduce less variation and make everything more streamlined. I'm curious what everyone else's experiences are.
Is Nathan breaking up for everybody else or just for me?
Yeah. He's breaking up.
His point was that I gathered he's probably implemented spent a couple hundred hours implementing substitutes from scratch before this API was available, and curious about whether anybody else has done that and whether they see opportunities for both reducing the amount of implementation effort and also increasing the consistency between substitute implementations.
I've done some ones by hand for a view data component before. I wasn't using active record to write to the view data target. I just had a class that wrapped up a SQL query for that. And so I hand rolled a class that basically does that, but I implemented, it just had an array and I'd shove in an object whose keys matched the parameters that would be passed to the actuator on that class. And then I had a were you called with these parameters method that I hand coded on it. This would have made it a lot clearer and about, I mean, reducing typing is usually not the bottleneck for shipping value, but where you can reduce it, all else being equal, I prefer it. And so this would have made it a lot clearer what was going on and with less code.
I'm pretty, excited. Well, Aaron brought up that, it's the massive code migration effort that we would be facing if we started adopting this stuff on our project. But I'm excited about the level of consistency that this would bring to substitutes. But we have countless substitutes in our solution across numerous libraries because we as well do a lot of integration with third-party services. And yes, it would save us time. It would be a lot cleaner. But the ability to have, the same way to build substitutes from scratch every time is, I think, the super interesting proposition for me.
I'd be,
well,
first of all, it's 370 substitutes. You can actually count them. I'll teach you how to do it sometime.
I love the support you can get from coworkers. There's nothing like going to work.
Nothing. Be happy. The thing I'm curious about is if our testing norms for substitutes will hold, and or if some of this, if there's like opportunity for fixtures that we'd be looking at, or if I mean, because we have a fairly light norm for testing substitute predicate methods, and it's based on the existing library we have. Themselves? Yeah. So it just makes me wonder.
Do you get to remove those tests?
I don't know. Because like you're still creating a bespoke predicate method, right?
Yeah. I think the tests we have are gonna stay because they're gonna cover that
I think so.
Duplicative predicate method. Yeah.
That was
right.
That was really the impetus behind the predicate macro, like the code generating macro called predicate. Was if it was just a macro, then we probably wouldn't have to write a test for it, because if it worked, in a test that used that predicate, then it worked. It would either work or it wouldn't work because it's a predicate, because it's a macro. But I'm also not a huge fan of the results of the code that's generated. But maybe we do it differently.
The other thing is you lose out on the documentation aspect of the test. Like now, now there's not a predicate method test. So you have to. I mean, not that going and looking at a declaration is particularly onerous, but it's inconsistent with other things.
Mm-hmm. Ultimately, we're going to have to we're going to end up figuring out new practice norms. We're raising the level of the abstraction up one notch, and we're going to go. The inevitable result is establishing new norms. So yeah, I suspect more conversation to come over the next little while. Certainly about the thing with the super method, with super and prepend, and where that can fit into the implementation. I would like I said, now we're on the predicate method, like the predicate macro thing, like I kind of want to remove it from the implementation. I'd love to get y'all's feeling, and I know it's brand new and fresh and stuff, but I'd love to get y'all's impression on whether or not you would use this version.
Type up the one-liner, like use the endless method, just because I know you love endless methods, but I mean, well, you can imagine here, replace replace content with ...
Hold on, let me open my, let me share my editor.
I was going to bring the endless method, but the two reasons why I always wrote up customize substitute are, one is to track invocation, that's solved with the new changes. And the other one is to return an array. That's apparently extremely common. I need to return an empty array instead of nil.
Instead of what?
Instead of nil, yeah, the whole version of Mimic return a nil on every invocation, right? The most common change I had to make is return an empty array instead.
It returns a void. It returns a mimic : void.
Oh, right. Sorry. Yeah, here.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, we've never run into that. I mean, we often have to return something, but that something is set, and we expect that to be controlled.
Right.
Anything that needs to control it. I can understand why you would want to return an array, because an array is effectively an empty, or a nothing for something that returns a set.
I realized I might have misworded that. I need to return an object where the method invocations are returning arrays. So essentially the mimic method invocation needed to return arrays, or well, an object that returns arrays on method.
Did you hard code the array, the empty array return, or did you build a method?
Yeah, that was the most, it's an hard-coded empty array. Like I needed just an empty array. That for some reason happened extensively in the code base I worked on.
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, Scott, so what I mean, if you just replace 10 through 12 with the ... version of it,
this?
yep, and then leave post there, but then ... this part. Yeah, so this is the macro.
What do you mean this is the macro?
I mean, this is what
equivalent.
It's effectively the macro because you have to specify keyword arguments. If you'd have to say posted content : some content.
Right. It's not the equivalent of this. That is correct. So it's not the equivalent of this, but it is the equivalent of the macro.
That's something that Ruby does, because sometimes I'll do, star args, and then I'll like unwrap that in something that I want to pass those to when I kind of want to do this same thing. But like you can just do ... and that basically just lets you pass the arguments from, the.
As of Ruby 3.
I think it's 2.7. 2.7.
2.7. Okay, so it's not a 3 thing.
Isn't it? Wait, 3.2. Oh yeah, we don't have 3.2.7 yet. So it's really 2.7. Interesting.
That's when ... was first introduced, but they fixed it since then, or they've improved it since then.
Star args or keyword args. That's what I'm used to.
Yeah. So ... is, you can think of each dot as one of these. This is one dot. This is another dot. This is another dot. I just made that up. It's patented. You can't use it. But yeah. So it's equivalent to this. Also, I think now in Ruby, you can actually just do star, and without any names and pass those, because
if you're not going to reference them, yeah.
No, if you could reference them.
Oh my God, really?
Yeah. Yep. I'm pretty sure. There's some weird nuances with it, but yeah, the ... is equivalent to these three things. It can only appear at the end, and you can put things before it.
So can you have stuff before the even ... operator if I wanted to have like my own named argument and then still pass stuff?
That's what he just said.
Yeah.
This won't work though. This won't work. I need to do content. Right?
Yeah, that's why I was saying it wasn't equivalent. You do need.
No. Content, comma. And then put content up here as the first argument.
I mean,
and comma. So this will give you this same thing,
Oh, and then you can pass in a bunch of.
and you can pass additional things
arguments.
optionally. This is what
Yeah.
Sean was asking about. Maybe
This is Ruby
maybe this doesn't work.
3.2. And it's, you have to be at Ruby 3.2 to be able to combine that content positional argument with the ... on line 14.
You might not be able to. I thought you could.
It's Ruby 3.2.
This is what I'm
This
running.
is Ruby 3.2.
I'm running 3.2.1.
Yeah. I think that this is an instance where you have to go to KWArgs. You could just start KWArgs here.
Well, there's lots of things we're going to explore in the
Yeah.
coming days.
Anyways, there's some combination of things that can give you what you want. The rules with ... are a little bit.
Any other questions or comments? Nathan, I hope you get out from underneath the floorboards there. Good luck. Scott, thank you for the presentation and for the work adding this to the library. This is great stuff.
Right on. Thank you. I think
Yeah.
it's about to get better too.
Yeah.
Oh, final question though. Final question. If, up or down vote, the predicate macro, keep it or remove it?
My gut, I'm a down vote for keeping it.
Down
Like,
vote.
Yeah.
I don't see what it offers above the other forms.
If you use an endless method, it's basically the same length, both in vertically and horizontally. So it's very close. And it is a little bit tricky, like it did confuse me reading it, while the other one was extremely explicit.
Yeah, that's also I think that's the biggest factor for me too. It seems just superfluous.
Yeah,
It's like, look, I know how to do metaprogramming.
Yeah, I think it invites unnecessary variation.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Cool. I think then that I'll have another release before start of the work day tomorrow that removes that predicate, the predicate macro. Thank you very much.
On then, right?
Oh, crap, I just changed everything.
Yeah. All right, cool. Thanks everyone. Thanks for coming. And we will catch you next time. Have a good one.
Thank you so much.
Good
And
seeing everybody.
again, think